My name is Josef, and you are listening to the Catacombic Machine, episode number 1. Yes, this is a new podcast, a new beginning, a becoming. Freestyle Christianity is no more, but out of the matrix that was freestyle Christianity emerged this podcast and also the project Future Crowds. There is also a new homepage, the catacombicmachine.com. Anyway, my first guest on this podcast is Peter Sjöstedt-H. That's a Swedish name, and Peter is born here in Sweden, but he lives in England. He's written a book called Numismatics. It's about metaphysics, metaethics, and psychedelics. I found it fascinating, and as you will hear, there's a lot of Nietzsche, there's a lot of Bergson, and there's a lot of Whitehead going on in this book. So find it. It is published by Psychedelic Press, and they sent me the book, so thank you, Psychedelic Press. But let's get on with it. This is Peter Sjöstedt. Enjoy. Peter Sjöstedt-H, welcome to the Catacombic Machine podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm honored.
So, my friend Alexander Bard sent me a link. I think that's how I found out about your new book, Numismatics.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I saw some of the names that you were referring to, Bergson and Whitehead and Nietzsche, and I thought this sounds interesting. And I think that's true also for the listeners, because all those three thinkers are familiar to them if they've been listening to this podcast, because we've been talking quite frequently about Bergson and Nietzsche and not so much about Whitehead, but I know that we have many listeners who also listens to Homebrewed Christianity, coming from Claremont, being the Whiteheadian capital of the world. So they're familiar with the voices. But I think you bring something new to the conversation, and so I'm very happy that you could be on the show.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you write about something that you call psychedelic phenomenology, and I'm thinking we can perhaps give like an elevator pitch for what is psychedelic phenomenology, and then we can deepen that as we go.
Okay. Phenomenology is a branch of philosophy which is to do with the analysis of different phenomenal or mental states. So in that sense, it refers to a branch, I should say, of philosophy of mind, really, a branch of philosophy of mind which analyzes the psychedelic experience in all its facets.
Yeah, and so you come back a few times to what you call the hard problems of consciousness.
Right, yeah. Well,
so maybe we can enter into the conversation talking about those problems. What are those problems, but also how does psychedelic phenomenology answer to them in a way that perhaps some previous strands of thought doesn't?
Okay. Well, for those who don't know, the hard problem of consciousness, which was coined by the philosopher David Chalmers about 15-20 years ago, is an old problem in philosophy, and it's simply the problem of how matter and mind relate. So there's a number of different views about that. So some people think that the prevalent view today is probably emergentism, which is that the mind emerges from matter through activity of the neurons and so on. But there are other views as well. For example, that mind simply is matter. It's a different name for it. Or mind is actually a function of matter. Or not so popular anymore, but behaviorism, which is the view that by a mental term like happiness, we actually just mean certain behavior. So like smiling, laughing, jumping, and so on. But all of these physicalist, essentially mostly physicalist views of the mind always have a number of problems, always end up in a number of paradoxes, and so there's still no solution to this hard problem of consciousness. for a number of reasons. The main reason is that matter is generally seen as a spatio-temporal entity, and from matter and from the movement of matter, it seems you can only get matter, or the movement of matter. From movement only comes movement, as Bergson says. How does the mind come from things that move, no matter the complexity? There's an old philosophical problem, like I said. Leibniz's mill is one example of it. So my own view is that instead of trying to overcome it by saying, well, the mind does emerge from matter somehow, just like liquidity emerges from molecules, I think we have to take a radical step back and question what we ultimately mean by matter, and that's what brought me really to Bergson and then Whitehead. Yeah. And initially, actually, Nietzsche, I think, sort of begins the conversation in later works, and then, of course, from him you realise Schopenhauer has big influence. So it's all tied up, really.
Yeah. So the psychedelic experience seen from some of these other strands of thoughts becomes problematic, right? You write write about that, and how you end up saying, for example, that if you have a psychedelic experience lying on the couch, behaviorism doesn't really cut to what is really going on.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the most pertinent example. I mean, when psychedelia became a thing, in the 1960s, unfortunately, in philosophy, we were at the most reductive level, where essentially consciousness, didn't exist, or was believed that consciousness didn't really exist. Like you said, it's just behavior. Behaviorism was big in the 60s, 50s, 60s. It's a real pity, I think, that psychedelia came out or coincided with that sort of a barren phase of the philosophy of mind, because there's so much that could have been extracted from this new phenomenology, this new analysis, or these new experiences, which simply weren't. They were simply dismissed. So one thought I had was that, on psilocybin, for example, one can lie on the floor, not move at all, yet one can travel through different universes and galaxies and meet all these sort of multicolored aliens and whatnot. And all of that can be experienced without moving anything. In fact, it's harder to move. So the behaviorist would have a very, very difficult time in explaining psychedelic phenomenology through its framework. So in a sense, you can use psychedelic phenomenology as falsification of behaviorism, one of many types of falsification of it. And that's just the start of the sort of value of psychedelic experience, I think, really, in terms of philosophy of mind.
Yeah. So in one paragraph, you write that one notion within our contemporary paradigm of belief is that consciousness is necessarily conditioned by a brain. No brain, no mind. Mm-hmm. However, under psychedelic phenomenology, this idea seems less tenable. Right. Can you unpack that a little bit? Because I think this will be somewhat familiar to some people, but I think, for the purpose of having people listen through the whole show, we should enter in and be clear about what we're talking about.
Okay, well, to be as short as possible, I think most people in our Western paradigm today believe that mind comes from brain, or is related to the brain, or rather, the brain is a necessary condition of the mind. But that really is an assumption. I mean, it can't be empirically proved. What can be empirically shown is that there are correlations between the brain and the mind. So if you damage the brain, you will have correlated damage to the mind, and if you temporarily damage the brain, as it were, through psychedelics, you will have the correlated change as well. But of course, there's no reason to believe that only a brain, the mind only requires a brain as its subvenience. I mean, for a start, we assume that other creatures have a mind. Of course, for example, dogs, octopuses, and so on. Of course, they have brains, but the brains are very different. An octopus's brain, at least, is very different from a human brain. But nonetheless, I think it's more plausible to say that it has consciousness than that it doesn't. So if we are to say that different kinds of brain are correlated to consciousness, then where do we stop? I mean, we go down to smaller brains, insect physiology and so on, but why stop there? And it's Whitehead, who ultimately is a panpsychist, who believes that mind is a fundamental aspect of nature, and the brain is required for a complex form of consciousness, but it's not the producer of consciousness. It's just a higher form to subvene it.
Yeah. So I think, for when we talk about these things, people want evidence, right? They want it to be empirically proved. Well, the things that we believe, but so you write also that it's not only about other creatures, but it's other humans. How do I know that your mind exists if we stay with those older models for thought?
Right, yeah. I mean, this is the old problem of other minds. When we simply assume that other people have minds because they behave in the same way as we do, they speak and so on. But we can't empirically prove that another person has a mind. You can only assume it. You can empirically prove that they have brains and that those brains function, but that doesn't prove the mind. I mean, what you're actually seeing there are physical movements. So when it comes to questions of the mind, proof is not empirical proof is just not something one can use. It's got a limited function, which is very useful for science in terms of creating technology and medicine and so on. But in metaphysics, philosophy of mind, it's one doesn't believe something because one has proof. Otherwise, you wouldn't believe other people have minds at all. Rather, you have to come up with the most plausible explanation of what you do experience. And if you really take that to heart, I think you end up with a lot of very unusual conclusions. But that's where I've been taken.
I usually think that Trump is a solipsist. Because he acts like it, because the ethical implications of course that's a joke, but the ethical implications of not accepting it as plausible that other people have minds is quite horrifying, because I can simply do whatever I want with anything. So
yeah,
it's just like a figment of my imagination. I imagined this evil person into being, so I can just get rid of that person.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you take analysis to such an extent, then you're left with solipsism ultimately, So the belief that only you as a mind exists, I mean, that's, if you're going to go by proof, that's where it takes you.
Yeah.
So you think, is that more plausible? Is that more plausible than assuming other people have got minds? No, it's not. So therefore, you assume other people have minds. That means you move away from proof. And that means you have to use other reasons for believing things, as mathematicians do. Mathematics and logic doesn't rely on empirical proof, although it's related to it. So, you have to do, in other words, that really distinguishes, I suppose, philosophy from science.
Yeah, and I think that's important, because sometimes philosophy is seen as sort of a slave to the sciences.
Well, it certainly has in the 20th century, and the 21st.
Yeah. But I do think actually that some of the thinkers that you refer to, Bergson and Whitehead, the sort of reemergence of interest in those kinds of thinkers open up for a better conversation between philosophy and science.
I think ultimately, yeah. And Whitehead himself was a mathematician. Then he was a teacher of physics at Cambridge, and he became a metaphysician later in life at Harvard. But he knew science inside out. I mean, he had a different interpretation of the theory of relativity, which he discussed with Einstein once. So he knew his stuff. But yet, he realized the limitations of that. But of course, we live in an age where science is the new priesthood, really, and people think that ultimately, if something's been proven by the scientists, then that's it. And even philosophers believe that, as you suggest, in the 20th century, philosophy was seen really as the handmaiden of science. But I think that, like I say, especially with the mind now, we've come to a cul-de-sac, so we need to take a step back and see alternative routes.
Yeah, so you mentioned Whitehead being a mathematician and spending some time with Einstein. Both those statements are true also of Bergson.
That's right, yeah. In fact, Bergson published a book about time in relation to Einstein's theory, but then he withheld its publication because he realized he had made a mistake. Yeah. So, but nonetheless,
the book last year, I think, about, it's called The Philosopher and the Scientist, maybe. Did you read that one?
I haven't read it, but I've heard about it. I read recently a book about Einstein's friendship with Gödel in Princeton, which was very interesting, actually. Gödel was a logician, and apparently they spent most of the time every day speaking about Kant's philosophy in Princeton. Oh, yeah. That's how Einstein, finished his years. Yeah.
Yeah, but he was a Kantian, so.
I always hear. I mean, I've got this great book called Einstein, Philosopher Scientist, edited by Schilp, and it makes it very clear that I think all the great scientists really were philosophers as well, or they dabbled in that. So Einstein did. Heisenberg wrote a book, Philosophy and Physics, and Schrödinger. So I think at the highest level, where science becomes very interesting, those scientists are philosophers as well, or at least they're aware of the philosophical issues.
Yeah. Okay. So let's look at Bergson and his notion about that the brain filters consciousness to one's bodily requirements. What does that mean?
Well, this notion's found mostly in his book Matter and Memory, which I think is one of the greatest books ever written by mankind. What does it mean? Well, okay. It's always very difficult to explain Bergson, I find, because it just involves a different way of thinking. But I'll try. Bergson starts by saying that perception is not a representation of objects out there, as it were. Like Kantianism, transcendental idealism says, we have these phenomena, and they're representations of what really exists, noumena, and they're completely distinct. And Kant said we'll never know what reality in itself actually is, noumena. Well, Bergson says that perception is part of the object it perceives. In other words, there's no real dichotomy, distinction between one's perception of an object, in inverted commas, and that object. So when we see something, that part of that object becomes part of us, because it's all one undifferentiated process. So I think the example I use in my book is when one looks at a star. If you analyze what that really entails? It entails the radiation of the star moving through the cosmos to our eyes. Now, of course, that movement from the star is one process, and one should be wary of not thinking there's a star and there's light that comes out of the star. Rather, the star is, or part of the star is the light that comes out of it. And one of Bergson's and Whitehead's main concerns is language, because every word, of course, cuts up reality into parts, and that's what makes our metaphysics go off. But anyway, so with the star, the light from the star, which is part of the star, goes down, hits the earth. It might happen to hit somebody's eyes. That light then transposes, that process transforms into an electrical current through the optic nerve, which goes to the visual cortex, and then that could result in further movement, such as saying, look, a star, or something like this, with the mouth muscles. That's one long process. So that star, which is a process, and Bergson doesn't believe in substance and attributes. He only believes, like Whitehead, in attributes. Everything is attribute. Substance is just a reification of that. That one process is perception. It's also causality. It's also the actual world. But of course, we only see an extraction. We only see part of the star. We don't see all of the star. We can only perceive that which is of which fits into our evolutionary, what shall I say, our evolutionary limitations. So we only see, we don't see the radiation from the star. We only see the electromagnetic light within the visual spectrum, and so So that's a start. So you must realize that part of the object is part of the subject. Whitehead calls this vectorization, the principle of relativity. Now, as I suggested then, we have evolved to, or all organisms have evolved to only see part of reality, and that part is that part which we can use, in other words, that we can act upon. Everything else is, as it were, ignored, for Bergson at least. For Whitehead is a bit different. And so we see a fraction of reality which is related to our practicality, or our power upon things. So that's what Bergson means by filtering, by the, I think it's known in Aldous Huxley as a sort of a valve, what's he call it, the sort of valve view of consciousness, something like this. So that's the first step.
Yeah, so maybe we can throw in a concept here, duration.
Duration, okay, so duration is a concept that Bergson contrasts with time in the physicist sense. So duration is lived time, it's experienced time, which means that it's perceptions, as I mentioned with the star, that by the way he calls pure perception. That is an abstraction in the sense that all perceptions involve memory, so even a colour like red involves the contraction of hundreds of billions of waves into one quality, in other words, not a quantity into a quality. That can only happen if you take a certain segment of time and reduce it to a quality. Now duration is conscious time, and that's real time for Bergson. Duration is real time. However, humans have got, he says, a propensity to divide things spatially. So when we think about time, when we represent time, we think of a timeline, an axis, and we divide it into instants, and then we model things upon that. I mean, this is one of his big issues with Einstein. But of course, this spatialized time, it doesn't matter if it goes forwards or backwards because it's an abstraction anyway. But in reality, duration is one way only, as it were. And also, I should say that he talks about rhythms of duration. So we can contract certain segments of time, an instant of a second, into a quality like red. But other creatures, of course, could perhaps contract larger segments of time or smaller segments in time into different qualities, which means that different organisms will experience time in different durations, but of course the physical time would be the same. So for example, in one physicist second, I might see the color red, whereas another organism at the micro scale might see a myriad of different qualities moving, as it were. So as organisms become more and more complex, they can contract more and more quantities into qualities. So humans are much more complex than amoebas, of course, and that means that we have more qualia. We can contract more of the past into qualities so as to be able to act upon it. And Bergson, interestingly, in Creative Evolution, one of his works, says that we're sort of heading to more and more complexification, and so there's a sort of and then he talks about a potential Superman in a Nietzschean sense almost, which has got more and more control over its environment by being able to make further quantities into qualities. So that's a sort of so that's a link to Nietzsche.
I think something that is part of that link to Nietzsche and the Nietzschean critique of much of his contemporary religion and philosophy is the critique of representational thinking. You touched upon that term before, representational thinking.
Yep.
And I think one way that I usually think about it is that we have for thousands of years thought that we live in this flux and we need to break out of time into the eternal space heaven or God or what you will, where truth resides. But for Bergson, it's quite the opposite, because to him, we live in a static world, or we think in a static world of phantoms of the real.
Yes.
And so our actual mission is rather to break into time.
And that's right, yeah. So we need to break down the forms, as it were, the Platonic forms, and live in duration. And again, this then distinguishes duration from physicist time. Yes, quite right.
And I think that relates to something that you write later on, where you say that it is the practical will that determines the extent of human consciousness, what we talked about before.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thus, if one theoretically closed off the will, one could thereby open the door to that greater overarching mind.
Yeah, well, this is the great intersection, as you suggest, then, between Bergson and Nietzsche, and also Schopenhauer, as it happens. Yeah. So, I mean, Bergson talks about dreams, and he does actually talk about drug use as well, with hashish, the French, related to the French hashish users. But yeah, that's right. So, I mean, Schopenhauer talks about, if when one really has an aesthetic contemplation, one has quelled the will, which is fundamental to his philosophy, of course. Nietzsche overtakes that. But Bergson, I think, implications of Bergson's philosophy at least does it more, it serves more interest. So, yeah, so like I was saying, we perceive that which is in our practical interest. But then, as you say, if we were somehow to suppress the will, that means we would perceive things not according to what's in our interest, but according to what's there, or what's in our memories. So he talks about memories being more accessible during the time just before sleep, for example. But then, of course, that's where psychedelics come in. So I speculated in my book that when you take psychedelics, it sort of completely breaks down the functioning of the physical organism. And so in floods, not only more of the surrounding environment, but also more of memory. You don't just select memories which are of practical use. A number of memories flood in. Thomas de Quincey talks about this with regard to opium. And also for Bergson, there's beyond the memory domain, there's the creative domain. Ultimately there's this creativity which pushes the universe, and perhaps breaking down the functioning of the body allows a sort of more primal access to this creative dimension that Bergson speaks about.
Yeah, and so you write, I think, a bit funny about hallucinations, because for most people, hallucinations is something that happens to you while you're on psychedelic drugs, or perhaps if you have a fever or something. But if you hallucinate, that's something which you experience which is not real. But you talk about our actual perception of reality as psychedelic.
Well, yeah, I mean,
or as a
hallucinatory, yeah. Well, if you accept that we only see a fraction of reality, then of course we're not seeing reality as it is in itself, in its fullness. We're seeing just a very biased view of reality, which in that sense is a hallucination, or at least is a hallucination as if you believe that what you're seeing is real, if you have a sort of naive realist view. So what you are seeing is real, but it's not the totality of the real, should I say. So in that sense, you can say that normal perception is the hallucination. Taking psychedelics, I conjectured, might open up more of what is out there, which is, vastly more than one can perceive, generally speaking.
Yeah, if we could perceive everything, we would really perceive nothing, right? It would be just chaos.
Yeah, it would be a blooming, buzzing confusion, as William James says. But also, of course, we wouldn't be able to act upon it. It would just be too much. We would not be able to move, really, or distinguish things. And that's why we do perceive what we perceive, because it helps us survive and develop. But I think most people really, if they think about it, will accept that this is but a fractional aspect of reality, nothing more. And
another thing that I think is interesting that you write that perhaps would at least disturbed some people's understanding, is that language is useful because it's extremely misleading.
Yeah, I mean, this is where Bergson and Whitehead are very similar again, and Nietzsche can really, because something Alan Watts, I think, drew a lot from with regard to Whitehead. But it's so when you're talking about processes, you have to divide it into parts, and parts that cause parts, and then we get these problems about what is causality, and what's the relationship between something and its attributes, and so on and so forth, and then. Yeah, like words and also syntax, is like noun and predicate and so on, and just creates these entities. It reifies them, as it were, creates these entities out of words which one falsely believes are true, and then one tries to work out how they all relate to one another. And this is a sort of a byproduct of the intellect, as Bergson calls it, and he says sometimes, ideally, you would return to intuition, which is seeing things in their primal flux. But it's very difficult because we have evolved intellect to exactly break reality into parts, so to act upon them.
Yeah, and I mean, in one sense, language then, of course, is useful for us, but it can also be in a kind of prison that makes us not see that the world is changing. For example, I mean, the underlying notion here is that all existence is movement.
Yeah, that's essentially process.
But since language isn't, it might trick us into believing that reality is actually static, truth is static, and so on.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the big problem with the evolution of our minds. We've become very static thing. I think Platonism comes naturally to people in the sense of dividing things into units.
I mean, that's something Bergson says, that humankind suffers from the habit of asking poor metaphysical questions.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Right, and that's related to that.
Yep.
So when we talk about, I mean, all these things bleed into one another, but when we talk about our understanding of the world, it has evolved for practicality rather than for knowledge. And so can you tell us some of the implications of such a statement?
Well, I always like to relate Bergson here to Nietzsche, because what does practicality really mean for Bergson? And generally, it means that one can act upon things, one can manipulate things according to one's interests. What does that mean? Well, one's interests really is one's will, we can call it that, what one wills, what one desires. And so we have this will to, let's say, manipulate things or work upon them. Manipulate is a very derogatory term, but I should say a will to act upon things, help others, but also help oneself and so on. Now, of course, a term for this Nietzsche has is the will to power. And this doesn't mean, is often interpreted as a sort of megalomaniac, like a sort of a principle of greed or something like this. It's not necessarily. It just means that all of life acts upon its own practicality, its own interest. That's not only the interest of the individual, but also of the group, the family, the species, and so on, and the world, it could be. So, if you realise that, then you realise that our perception is based on our will to power. This is something Nietzsche talks about, mainly in his Nachlass, though his notebooks. It's late of the 1880s. And also then that leads into a scepticism, I think, of ideologies. And there's something else I wrote about in my book, of course, with regard to nihilism. So what that ultimately means, what practicality means to our, in the broader sense, is that, yes, we see reality only as a fraction, and it also leads, I think, to political skepticism.
Yeah, and so can we, I know, I don't think that you explicitly talk about this very much, at least, but maybe you can relate that to when Nietzsche talks about reactive thinking, or to be moved by resentment.
Right. Okay, I'm just trying to remember. Oh yeah, so that's in the genealogy of morality, isn't it? The resentment, yeah. So that's, to those who don't know, I mean, in the genealogy, he speaks again, it's also in Beyond Good and Evil, he speaks again about master and slave morality. So, master morality, he exampled in the Roman Empire. It values things like strength, strength, honor, pride, and so on, as Aristotle did. And Nietzsche, yeah, he said that what happened historically with regard to the morality that we have today in the West is that there was a reaction against the rulers, the Romans, as it pertains to the West, of their morality, their master morality, and the opposite, or the values rather, were seen as vices and vice versa. So what the Romans saw as a vice, humility, weakness, and so on, was by the Jewish underclass, Nietzsche says, seen as virtues. And of course this morality turned into Christianity, especially with St. Paul. And then of course, the history of Christianity, as you know, is history. The rest is history. And that's why Nietzsche says we live with the morality we do today, because of this inversion of master morality in Roman times. And what was your question about how it relates to what? Sorry.
No, I think we can move on from there. But looking at politics today, I think it's obvious that everyone's reactive in their politics.
What do you mean by reactive specifically?
Specifically, that number one, I guess, that they negate the world before they start reasoning, and so there's this split that is there. And when you have, when you have that split in place, you can abstract anything in your heaven.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that's quite interesting. I mean, that reminds me of the difference between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Ultimately, Schopenhauer is a pessimist, and Nietzsche ultimately is an optimist. So, Schopenhauer sees the world and he thinks it's absolutely terrible, and he promotes a sort of ascetic lifestyle, whereas Nietzsche sort of accepts reality as it is, doesn't judge reality.
Yeah, amor fati.
Yeah, love of fate. Yeah, precisely. And that, to live in a proactive way, if we oppose that to reactive, is very difficult, I think. But this is the point of Nietzsche's eternal return, ultimately, to not regret anything you have done, to accept all of reality as it is.
And you have that very nice saying by Nietzsche that he desires to be only a yes-sayer.
Right, yeah.
And for the listeners, they know Gilles Deleuze that we've talked about him quite frequently on the podcast. And Deleuze talks about the affirmation of differences, referring back to Nietzsche, right. And that the affirmation of every difference can open up for an immanentist way of reasoning that doesn't presuppose the split. Rather, Deleuze writes about the plane of immanence as this pre-philosophical plane on which thinking can then sort of populate with concepts and conceptual personas.
Right.
And that's what he thinks that Nietzsche is doing, and with Zarathustra as a persona, for example.
Yeah, no, it's quite right. I mean, he does say that, but of course Nietzsche's known as quite a negative thinker by most people, I think. But he's known. I think most people think he's a pessimist and a massive critic of reality. But actually, when you really get to the heart of it, it's the opposite.
Yeah, I think he's a very very positive thinker, and even in the titles like the gay science.
Yeah.
But of course, if you're someone who want to defend the status quo, if you want to defend certain power relations and don't want anything to change, of course he's going to be a threat. So in that sense, he is negative. But the negativity or the critique is always in the service of the affirmation.
Right. Nietzsche is a danger to most human systems, I think, because he's too honest. He just touches the raw nerve, and it breaks down many movements ultimately. And it's sort of, I suppose that's why he's partly responsible for the sort of 20th century existential angst. It's sort of, well, that's the first stage of it, isn't it? That you realise, like, everything I've believed and been taught is probably just based on power structures rather than any absolute Platonic truths, as it were.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a difficult way of life. I sometimes quoted from the Antichrist, where he says that the most spiritual men, as the strongest, find their happiness where others would find their destruction, in the labyrinth, and hardness against themselves and others in experiments.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
and that's not just some cool way of saying I want to stare that void into the eyes, or that I really want to go deep. It's a way of living that's probably not going to take you very to a job position or something.
No, it's a Dionysian way, isn't it? This is the tragedy as affirmation. Yeah, and it's not easy. And but of course Nietzsche had to live it because of his ailments. He suffered something like, I think in the late 80s was sort of 2/3 of a year. He was sort of, he couldn't write or talk hardly. He was so he had, but he affirmed his suffering. So he used his suffering as a catalyst for his work, and that's really what he's sort of advocating to others, not to everyone, but to others. If you can turn your suffering into a world affirmation, then you've gone beyond that reactive level, because it's so easy, of course, if you're suffering, to blame the world around you, to create these systems where everyone's wrong about whatever it may be. But to not criticize reality completely is very, very difficult, because again, like Bergson, it goes against our natural grain of thinking.
Yeah, and I think there's that connection between Nietzsche and Bergson, and consequently, I guess, Whitehead as well, is strong, at least in my own reading, because the Bergsonian intuition starts with this critique of bad metaphysical questions that confuse the less with the more, that we start out with this nothingness and assume that there is a scale going from nothingness to fullness. And that's how we end up in this understanding of time that you were talking about previously.
I mean,
and rather than thinking like that, Bergson says we shouldn't believe that there is this idea of nothingness which is less than the idea of something. So he critiques the question, why is there something rather than nothing?
Yeah, that's a fantastic critique. I mean, that's really, that for me, when I read that as an undergraduate, was a sort of worldview changer, really. Just to tell you, to the audience members who don't know, it's basically, the argument is this, that when we use, again, it's about words, isn't it? Like when we use the word nothing, what we really mean is nothing of interest, nothing of practical interest. So if I say there's nothing in the other room, I don't literally mean it. I mean there's nothing of interest to me, or there's nothing on TV. Even if the TV's off, there will be something on the TV, of course, So that's what nothing really means. It means substitution of something of interest for something not of interest. Now, of course, when you apply that word to the whole universe, it ends up as a contradiction, because you can't replace the whole universe with something else, because the whole universe is everything. So that means that the idea of absolute nothing is an oxymoron. It just doesn't make sense. It's a trick of language, which means that there could never have been a time of nothingness. There was never nothingness, and that really has sort of fundamental implications for how you view the universe in terms of the big possibility of the Big Bang and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I mean this is a theological podcast. We oftentimes interview theologians, and within theology, you have this great tradition of creatio ex nihilo,
creation out of nothing.
And exactly, creation out of nothing. And do you know who Catherine Keller is?
I'm afraid not. No.
She's a very interesting thinker, and she's written a book called Face of the Deep, where she talks about this and how, I think in the 4th century AD, this notion that God created the world out of nothing emerged. It wasn't something that's present earlier on. And she relates it to patriarchy, because how could this father God, this male God in the heavens, need another? And so God must have created out of nothing. And so in her work, she relates very much to Deleuze in that book, and talks about creatio ex profundus.
Yes. No, you did right. I read an article by you which mentions that, actually. Now you say it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I'll look into that. I mean, I think with regard to the Big Bang theory, which I suppose is a sort of scientific version of that, it was actually suggested by a Catholic priest, I believe.
Yes. I think a monk.
Right. So, and of course, Catholicism adopted it readily because it fit into their dogma about creatio ex nihilo. Yeah. So there are certainly there's certainly a lot of religion involved in modern science, which I think most people are completely blind to.
Yeah, and you're right about lots of Christian values living on as well. So maybe we can talk about this in the sciences, but we can perhaps also talk about values this way. Where does values come from? Because sometimes, I end up in conversations, and usually, since I've changed the name of the podcast, if you noticed, it's now called the Catacombic Machine, but it was called Freestyle Christianity. So of course people assume a lot of things when you have the name Christianity in there, and so you have to live with a few prejudices against what about what you're thinking about.
Again, the danger of words, precisely.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean that's part of the fun too, because if it provokes, it's probably useful.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's why Whitehead creates his own vocabulary, because of all the baggage that these words have, especially in philosophy.
Which makes him very easy to read.
Yeah,
the thing is, when you talk about these things with values, and it's a critique from, I mean, especially in my country, you are from Sweden, but you haven't lived here very much.
Yeah.
But I mean, Sweden is a very secular country, and so we talk about values, and there's a critique of religion and about religious values on the basis that secular values are these neutral truths that just drop down from heaven or where.
Well, this is the danger of Nietzsche to Sweden, because these so-called secular neutral values are, of course, as tenuous as Christian values. In other words, they are they lack the foundations. And this is the whole point of God is dead. This famous thing that if you don't believe in God, then you've got no right to Christian morality. And by Christian morality, he means Western morality, as epitomized by Sweden. I must say, I've lived in Sweden for about 4 years, as I mentioned to you before, and I do think Sweden's a very ideological country. It's got rid of it's the most I think Sweden and Czech Republic are the most secular countries in Europe, but Sweden, I think, is one of the most ideological countries I've ever really visited.
Yeah, I think Sweden is religious about its own
lack of religion. It's religious about its secularism. Yeah, quite right.
Yeah.
I
mean, you can make the case as Daniel Barber is doing. I think I mentioned him in that article you referred to, where he talks about secularism as just sort of this next move of Christianity.
Yep. Well, that's Nietzsche's point ultimately, isn't it?
Yeah. He gets it.
That Christianity has won because we now adopt the values of Christianity without, number one, without realizing that they're Christian values, and number two, without needing this ultimate foundation, which he alleges is the existence of God.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, if you look into like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I mean, most people subscribe to them. They're pretty good stuff in there. But it's premised that on the notion that all people are born free and equal.
All are equal under the eyes of God, exactly. Yeah.
We are clearly not. I mean, that's a negation that opens up for this whole ideology that are then to be seen as sort of a heavenly code that we should impose on people that breaks against it. And so you can think about Kafka in The Trial, and the chapter where Joseph K is in the cathedral with the priest, And the priest talks about the law and how the law, it's not necessary that you believe in it, but it's necessary for society to function. And so Joseph K. responds, that's a dismal thought, because that makes untruth a universal principle. And that's, of course, a Nietzschean thought.
Yes.
That start out with a negation. And to me, many movements with sort of a positive message ultimately get trapped by this, because they create this sort of heavenly binary code that are then seen as
binding on all.
Yes. And so in Sweden we have conversations about feminist snow shoveling, which sounds strange to most other people, but and it's not that you can't have a conversation about what would be best for women to shovel snow first, or where to shovel snow first, but ultimately perhaps that binary code shouldn't be ruling everything.
No.
There are other factors to take into consideration, and so to speak with Bergson, you're missing out on qualitative differences, and that will in itself become oppressive towards other people.
Absolutely. I mean, of course they have got their, even a notion of egalitarianism, as Sweden promotes, of course is an illusion. I mean, they will not promote, for example, neo-fascists or anything like that. They're stamped down heavily, which means that they're not open to contrary views at all. But the ultimate point here is that the ultimate foundations of the morality, which so many Swedish politicians, for example, are adamant about, just cannot be substantiated. And it ultimately comes to, I've had a few conversations with Swedes about this, and they just simply say, well, it's just common sense, or it's obvious that this is wrong. That's where it comes to.
Common sense to us.
In other words, it goes down to an intuition. But of course, as you know, the problem with that is if someone with a contrary intuition will have just as much right to say what they will say.
Yeah, so let's open up a space where we can have open and honest conversation with IS.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, it leads to things like this.
It's impossible. And I think ultimately that makes us, probably Sweden, I think also Sweden is a prime example of this, but it's hypocritical, because it's almost like when America want to impose democracy in other countries, because democracy is the ruling of the people. But it only works as long as the people vote for the people that the Americans want in power.
Yeah, of course. And it also depends on how, who the press are for and so on and so forth. So, but yeah, I mean, it's just like when the British Empire went to Africa and they said, look, we're imposing Christianity upon these people, and that can only be a good thing, can't it? So it's the same thing. Christianity in the Victorian age, of course, and before was the essence of values, and now it's democracy and freedom and so on and so forth. But ultimately, my personal opinion, this is very different from most, of course, is that they are both religions,
Yes.
But the benefit that Christianity has is at least it says there is a God to substantiate those values. Now, I don't believe in that God, so I think that's void as well. But at least they can refer to that, to go one step further back. Whereas the secularists, or let's say the humanists, cannot do that. So it ultimately comes to this, why should we care about other people? Why is pleasure greater than pain? Questions like this just cannot be answered in a secular worldview. And I am a secularist
trying to prove it, right?
Yeah, I even actually had a little conversation with Sam Harris about the is-ought problem, and just online. But he just can't. I mean, this is part of the essence of my neo-nihilism in my book. This is-ought gap can't be bridged unless there is a God.
Yeah, can you elaborate on what that problem implies? Because I think that's something that perhaps listeners don't recognize.
Okay, well, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, sort of came up with this gap. It's also known as Hume's guillotine. And it's this, that from a fact, something is the case. One cannot logically derive a prescription, an ought. So, for example, from the fact that, let's just say allegedly, it's not true, from the fact that there are no homosexuals in the animal kingdom, one cannot therefore say, therefore one ought not to be homosexual.
Or the other way around.
Or vice versa.
Because that's what you often hear. Look at the animal kingdom.
Right.
There are homosexuals, therefore it is good that we have human homosexuals as well.
Precisely, and that's even, if you accept the sort of a concept of homosexuality, Foucault, the Nietzschean criticised that, for example, so it gets very deep. But the ultimate point here is that, from a description, one cannot logically derive a prescription. From an is, you cannot get an ought. And Schopenhauer as well, he's forcefully argued this point, and but he's still an ethicist, because he said he's still a moralist in the sense that he said, look, these modern forms of morality which say one ought to do this, one ought not to do that, ultimately is based on the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, is ultimately Judeo-Christian. This form of morality which is imperative. And he says this is infantile, we must reject this form of ethics. It's demeaning, really, to thinkers. But nonetheless, he maintained a morality in the sense that he said, you can descriptively value someone, so someone who's maybe honest and friendly and whatever, you can say that's a moral person. Now, he just happens to be that way, just like you might like rabbits and hate rats. The rabbit and the rat can't help it, who they are, but nonetheless, you can still value rabbits more than rats. And it's the same with people, Schopenhauer says, you can value what he deemed to be moral people over immoral people. But it's quite insignificant to say a person is doing something wrong. Nietzsche takes it one step further and says, and Schopenhauer himself inherits the Judeo-Christian way of thought, because what Schopenhauer valued descriptively were Christian values ultimately, people who were egalitarian and so on and so forth. And so Nietzsche pushes it beyond that.
Yeah, and I mean, all this in a sense is also a kind of critique against natural theology. So
tell me how exactly.
Well, if you have this good creation where God has created a specific order, if you can decipher that order, you can then determine what is good. And so if God has created male, female, there should be no homosexual. That's not good because it's not natural.
Okay, so you're talking about Thomist natural law,
yes,
that kind
yes,
of thing.
Yes,
yeah. Okay, I see. Yeah, no, quite right. Yeah, absolutely, it is. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, if you don't believe in God, yeah. So.
Yeah, of course. But I think that shows how this is something that goes a long way back, but also how that sort of Christian history still impacts our thinking today, although perhaps most people think they're secular.
Absolutely. I mean, like Nietzsche makes Richard Dawkins look like a bishop. I mean, Dawkins is so Christian in his thinking, ultimately, in a sense, especially in his moral theory. Yeah.
Yes, and I guess my point is that the reversal doesn't make it better, because some people would just say, so it is not natural that something is in a specific way, like you said. If there weren't any homosexuals within the animal kingdom. But it just simply by reversing the old Christian notion doesn't make it true or good or anything.
No, I mean ultimately, whatever the facts are, it has no effect on how making any universal prescriptions to others in terms of. Yeah. And so of course this happens all the time. Our morals are prescriptive, generally speaking, normative. Why is this? Because of course to moralize is to attempt power over others. If you tell others, one ought not to do this, you ought not to do that, then you are trying to control their behavior. Yes. And you might try to sanction that with some kind of secular morality, whatever, which I don't think works, or you might try to do that with a sort of a divine king, a god, but I don't think that works either. So where does that leave you? It leaves you in this kind of, to start with, a sort of form of existential angst, I suppose. It takes you away from it takes you away from your time. It takes you away from your society. And so I always find it very hard to discuss ethics with people who haven't really read Nietzsche. It sounds very pompous, but
Nietzsche would have liked you saying it.
Yeah, it's probably
So
no doubt.
at least there's that.
But before you can discuss ethics, you have to sort of lay down the options, and part of those options include Nietzsche. So
let's go back a little bit to panpsychism. You mentioned it before, and we've talked a little bit about Bergson, but we haven't said that much about Whitehead so far. So can we talk about how reality is fundamentally metaphysical creativity?
Okay. Actually, I was just about to mention Whitehead with regard to something you said about nature being this way or that in our last discussion, because Whitehead emphasized the fact that the distinction between what's natural and what's artificial is not a real distinction. In other words, a car, a Volkswagen car is as natural as a bird's nest. It's a creation of nature. It's part of nature. It's the reshaping of certain natural elements into other ones which are useful for us. So for a start, so whatever humans happen to do, that is nature. If you define nature as everything, the universe, which he does and which I do. And Whitehead's philosophy generally gets rid of a number of dichotomies like that. Okay, but getting back to panpsychism, with regard to Whitehead, his panpsychism is generally called pan-experientialism. That was coined by David Ray Griffin, who was a process philosopher, process theologian actually, great writer. Why does he believe in panpsychism then? Well, there are so many reasons, but one of them he got from William James, which is this notion that if you don't believe in panpsychism, it means that you must believe that at some point in the universe in the past, there was no mentality at all. Before certain life evolved. Now, William James says, therefore, if you believe that, there must have been a point where suddenly consciousness, or let's say sentience, as the basic form of consciousness, there must have been a point where sentience suddenly popped into existence. It never existed before, and then suddenly it popped into existence. Now, if you take mentality to be aspatial, like non-spatial, so for example, you wouldn't say an emotion has a certain spatial certain spatial measurements. You wouldn't say happiness is 10 centimeters long or something. So in that spatio-temporal universe, for something different in kind, in other words, mind, to pop into existence at one point, maybe that was with, for example, the emergence of a small brain in some small animal or something. If you believe that, you really have, that is such a radical jump of ontology, You've got first everything which is describable in terms of space and time and cause, power, force. And then you've got this completely new type of reality, like a thought, a desire or something. If you really believe that, you have to really explain it, But no explanation's ever been offered. So is it not more plausible, James writes, and Whitehead follows him, to say that mentality never jumped into existence, rather mentality was always there at the beginning? That gets rid of that jump problem, as it were. And as we were saying with regard to proof, you can't, metaphysics goes beyond empirical proof. We talk about plausibility and how certain theories can resolve certain paradoxes down the line. That's one way in which panpsychism makes more sense. Also, going back to the first thing you said about the hard problem of consciousness, which is related to what I said as well, how does mind emerge from matter? It's such a big problem because it just seems that, from movement you get movement, from matter you get matter. The laws of physics concern how certain material or energetic entities affect others. But how do you get something of a different kind, like I say, a mental state, from that? It's a complete mystery. Now, again, is it not more plausible to say it doesn't? And this is where Whitehead comes into his own now, beyond what Bergson, I should say. Whitehead was very aware of our tendency to abstract things and to to take those abstractions for real concrete entities, in other words, reification. So he says matter, the concept matter, is really an extraction from the real. It's only the shell of the real. Everything we call matter has an immanence, an internal aspect, an intrinsic aspect, which is a very basic form of mind. Now, it's not consciousness. Consciousness, of course, is generally used to mean, human thought, memories about what you did last year and so on. But very basic forms of sentience, like perhaps desire or fear. It simply makes more sense to say that what we call matter energy includes that. And matter is just an extraction or an abstraction from that concrete whole. Now, the problem occurs then when you take this abstraction, which is matter, which is only the outside part of reality, take that as real, as concrete, and then from that abstraction, you try to understand how you get sentience from that abstraction. Well, that's where you go wrong. It's a bit like I say in my book, abstracting all the colours from a painting, from a cake, and painting that cake using those exact colours, and then expecting that you will get the flavour of the cake from that picture. It just won't happen, because you are trying to derive that which you have omitted from the abstraction of matter in the first place. And that's really the beginning of Whitehead's panpsychism.
Okay, so if we then talk about psychedelic experience.
Okay, like I said, Whitehead was a mathematician to start with and a logician, and his student was Bertrand Russell, and they wrote a book about the foundations of mathematics together, the logical foundations there. Anyway, Russell spoke about universals. By universal, he meant something like qualia, like a concept or a colour or some kind of perception, like whiteness. Whiteness is an example. Whiteness is a universal. And he says, what is whiteness? Now, if we accept that division between spatiotemporality and mentality, that epistemological difference, as a difference in kind, then whiteness can't be physical, in that abstract sense of physical. Now, so you say, okay, well, it's mental, it's part of someone's mind. But if you say that, of course, that means that the same person can't see the same thing over time a number of times, because it must be different each time. So in other words, and also different people can't see the same colour. There must be a multiplicity of things. But if you were to say that they see the same thing, in other words, they see whiteness, then you have to accept that whiteness is not spatiotemporal, it's not physical, and also it's not temporal per se. So it can't exist only at specific times, because then, like I say, it can't be multiply realized. So therefore, something like whiteness for Russell, and this gets into metaphysics now, of course, has to be eternal, which means timeless. It exists in a realm beyond physicality, spatiotemporality. And Russell makes very good arguments for this, even though it sounds completely nuts, to people who've never come across the idea before. But he says that these what he calls universals, then they don't exist in space and time, but they subsist. They have this eternal. They exist in this sort of realm. I think the word he uses, realm, of eternity. Now Whitehead follows that, and a lot of mathematicians, by the way, believe in these universals as well, the reality of these universals. Whitehead follows that, but he renames them to eternal objects because it differs somewhat from Russell. Santayana, by the way, also argues for this, and he calls them essences. But Whitehead believes in this realm of eternal objects, which ultimately is phenomenology, right? The things we see, our experiences. And these eternal objects, like whiteness, but also ideas and so on, they ingress, he says, a new word he made up, sort of, the meaning he made up, they ingress into actual entities. Now, an actual entity is the smallest unit of subjectivity for Whitehead, and we are these aggregates, or rather societies, of actual entities. But anyway, this eternal realm then enters into us according to practicality again, so that's where it coincides with Bergson. But interestingly, one could argue that, and Whitehead does allude to it with regard to drugs, if one then cuts that link to practicality by, like I say, stopping, stuffing up the neural synapses with certain chemicals like psilocybin or whatever. If one stops that ingression, then one conceivably is allowed entry into this realm of eternal objects, which is somewhat akin to Bergson's domain of creativity, I suppose. And it's an interesting argument to make that psychedelics allows one access into this realm. I mean, that's realm Whitehead calls God. But of course, this God is very different from the Judeo-Christian God, and later on, Griffin says at least that he regrets using the word God for this dimension. But nonetheless, if it is God, then the word entheogen for psychedelic makes more sense, because it means engendering God within. So that is one aspect, one route one can take when comparing psychedelic phenomenology to Whitehead's philosophy. That is the route of the eternal realm of eternal objects.
Yeah, and you're right about Whitehead's use of God, and you're criticizing it a little bit.
Yep.
So maybe you can talk about that, because most people that have ever heard of Whitehead on this podcast probably listen, as I said in the beginning, to homebrewed Christianity.
Yeah.
And so the entry, as it was for myself, to the writings of Whitehead comes through Christian thinkers such as John Cobb.
Yep.
And so maybe you can give another view then of how to think about Whitehead's notion of God, because I think the most cited part of Whitehead's work that I've ever read is this last chapter of Process and Reality, which is just this great celebration of Jesus.
Right. Yeah. A number of things to say there.
Yeah.
And those listeners won't like what I'm going to say, probably.
No, but I think that's good, because that's what I want this conversation to be about, in part at least.
Okay.
To challenge us.
Right. Well, where shall I start? Okay, I'll start historically. So Whitehead died in 1947, and his metaphysics was Process and Reality is 1929. So in the early 20th century, his metaphysics came out. And at that time, as I mentioned before, philosophy was getting very analytic, linguistic, and reductive. And he was out of his time, really, Whitehead. He was very well respected, but he just didn't fit into the philosophical milieu of the time at all. Except with regard to Bergson, who was his contemporary, but of course he was big in France, never really made it in Britain, for example. But so his work was sort of neglected in Britain and Europe to a certain extent. Bergson was sort of forgotten in Europe after the Second World War for some reason. But there was this American contingent which continued his work, and that's what you mentioned then, and that became known as process theology, Cobb, Hartshorne, people like that, which I think is very valuable. A lot of insights there which can still be exploited in today's philosophy of mind, for example. But he was ignored by analytic philosophers mostly in Britain, and continental philosophers he had a bit of influence on. Deleuze, I think, makes use of him a little bit. But in the last sort of 10 years, I should say that there's a lot of interest in Whitehead again, because of what he can offer now to discussions in the philosophy of mind. Galen Strawson, a contemporary philosopher, he's probably the most famous contemporary advocate for panpsychism, and he alludes to Whitehead. don't think he's read him properly. But nonetheless, he says, I think Whitehead spoke about these kind of things, you know. And so there have been a number of books about Whitehead's philosophy, which try to distance themselves a bit from the American branch. And the reason for that is the American branch emphasise the theology in Whitehead and the Christianity in Whitehead, the prima facie Christianity. And these, let's say, more British philosophers or European ones want to utilise the treasure in Whitehead, but not necessarily go down that Christian path. And I suppose I'm in that movement partly, but it's quite difficult. I mean, like I spoke about the eternal objects as an eternal realm, which he calls God, and you know, if you're a secularist, it's quite hard to talk about these eternal realms, really. So it is a difficulty, and some people have tried to get rid of the eternal objects, but I think it's very, very problematic. You really changed Whitehead's philosophy a lot then. But nonetheless, you know, Whitehead himself calls God. He calls it God, but he also calls it Arte, a Greek goddess. And at one point, he sort of calls it the devil, and so on. And so there is certainly this metaphysical, what should we say, entities too much, dimension, realm thing in Whitehead. I think the danger with calling it God, though, is that you then bring in all the Christian baggage. For example, that God as a divine commander. And Whitehead himself, he does go morally relativistic in many cases. You know, he says that, you know, art, logic, religion, and morals have all been seen as the most important aspects of life, but they will fluctuate, and importance transcends all of them.
Yeah, but I mean, you mentioned Hartshorne before, and he doesn't go down that route either, because he says God is not the unmoved mover, God is the most moved mover. And so that's sort of, I think, for many Christians, what has made them attracted to Whitehead's philosophy is especially that it's a move away from this omnipotent master in the sky. Well, and in one sense that avoids the theodicy issues.
Right, problem of evil, yes. Yeah, I suppose that's where Christians and secularists will really sort of come together in a way, because in one sense, if a secularist is to accept an eternal realm, he's sort of strayed into religious territory a bit. And if a Christian, you know, moves away from this divine command theory, then they've strayed a bit from Christianity. I mean, that's not typical Christianity, of course.
Yes.
So Whitehead, I suppose that you could sort of sum up the difference that way, that he sort of tones down Christianity, or he sort of makes more religious secularism.
Yeah.
The truth is probably somewhere exactly in the middle.
Yeah, to me personally, I think this whole conversation might actually be a little bit imprisoned, as we said earlier, by language and categories and belongings and so on. And so my hope, at least, is for these conversations to go on without having to sort of fight back against old traditions or secularism or whatever. But that there will be a more open conversation that isn't predetermined by previous answers. Because, I mean, that's, as Bergson says, that's our natural proclivity is to always try to understand what is new according to old categories, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about the pure essence of the thought, then of course you don't really need to touch upon what has passed before. You know, you can make connections, but then, as you say, that might polarize the debate.
Yeah.
So I think that's important, really, because, for example, when I say eternal objects, I know a number of people immediately would be opposed to that, without even looking into the reasons as to why they are pushed by Whitehead and Russell and others. I mean, Russell, of course, was a famous atheist at the time. You know, he wrote "Why I'm Not a Christian" and so on. But at the same time, he promoted this universal realism, this other form of Platonism, really. You know? So, no, I quite agree. Yeah, you shouldn't get hung up with a baggage of words. But at the same time, I still think it's, if you do want to talk about history, then I think that there's probably more paganism in Whitehead than Christianity in terms of love of nature.
Yeah, I'm not in a position to say I've read more Bergson than I've read Whitehead. But let's move on. We've talked for quite some time now, but I want to get to the neo-nihilism and allow for you to talk a little bit more about that if you want to.
Sure.
So we've talked about this with the moral issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we've perhaps had an idea about moral progress,
mm-hmm.
And that we are at the peak of human morality.
Well, that's what Sweden thinks. Sweden thinks about itself. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm talking about me and my people, the Vikings, who were very primitive, but now we have the best systems in the world to govern. Anyway, I'm thinking maybe you can talk a little bit about morality. Yeah.
Okay. Well, just to give you the general view of neo-nihilism,
yes.
It's a chapter in the book, but it was sold as a separate ebook online. And it had a bit of an influence. It influenced Marvel's new philosopher superhero Karnak, for example, strangely. But the essence of the argument in it is derived from really Hume, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. So I've said a lot already about it. It's the view that, now, first of all, I should say the nihilism I'm using here means moral nihilism. I'm not talking about the existence or lack thereof of facts. I'm talking about the objective truth of certain moral systems or lack of truth. So it's a moral nihilism for a start. And what it argues is that it brings together these philosophers, as I said. Starts with this is-ought problem from Hume, and basically argues with a number of examples that you simply cannot derive prescriptions from descriptions. Now, that's easy to accept logically, but if you really apply that to everyday life, it really distances you from your polis and your way of life in many ways, and you suddenly see all these political arguments and legal arguments and ideological arguments as you see it purely as a skeptic. Why? Because, again, if you don't believe in God, there is nothing to substantiate your moral view. However, having said that, and I can get into the technical details about that, you get into ifs, oughts, and so on and so forth, and means and ends and whatnot, if clauses. But what it ultimately does, or the ultimate point of it, is to free one's mind from guilt, for example, that one ought to have done this, ought to have done that, regret. It frees one's mind. It sort of makes one see everyday goings on from a sort of objective point of view. It probably has got negative effects as well. It sort of stops. It can, I suppose, initially stop you from getting involved with movements for greater purposes and so on and so forth. But also, I should say, it was written in the hyperbole. It was written quite aggressively, on purpose. It's a different style from other essays, which is probably why it became quite popular. But I suppose it ultimately comes from Nietzsche's point that God is dead. If you don't believe in God, you've got no right to the morality that we have today in the West. However, it doesn't get rid of values, because living is valuing. And this again goes back to Bergson now. Seeing the colours we do is valuing those colours, because evolution values those aspects which are of interest to us. And by interest, like I say it's to do with survival and development. So living is valuing. So it's not a negation of values. It's really a negation of absolute values. So it's nothing particularly new. I mean, it's been said a number of times before, but what's new, I suppose, is just the combination of those philosophers and the application of it.
Yeah, I think, Daniel Barber, who's been on the podcast in the past, I've mentioned him already, he talks about this in some sense as if, not the negation of eternal values, because I think that would simply just allow for that plane to rule you, but rather to affirm possibilities deemed as unthinkable by those in power, those who determine what is eternally true.
Right, yeah. And so you realize, you see the world as the layering of power structures. Interestingly, though, like I said, those people who do believe in objective morals, tend to be Platonists in terms of, the form of the good, the ultimate form of the good being sort of analogous to God. I sort of do, like I say, have sympathy for these eternal forms, but not in a moral hierarchy, which I think makes me very different from others. Now, I didn't write about that in neo-nihilism, but something to be written there later on. So you can believe in eternal objects, yet still be a nihilist.
So is this relativism?
It's not cultural relativism, no, not general relativism, because that's general. Well, as I understand it, it simply means you shouldn't judge other cultures because each culture's equal in terms of its value. But of course, that itself is a prescription. You ought not to judge others. So it's beyond that, really. I mean, in cultural relativism, I see it as a power structure analogous to any other.
Thank you so much, Peter, for coming on the show, and I hope that we can have you back sometime.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Hopefully that was as enjoyable for you guys to listen to as it was for me to talk to Peter. Mind-boggling stuff, right? Good first episode. And since you guys have listened all the way through, I assume you like this stuff, and therefore, maybe you want to support me. Don't forget, go to patreon.com and find the Catacombic Machine to support the podcast. You can email me at thecatacombicmachine@gmail.com. You can email me questions, you can email me suggestions for what to make of this new show. Perhaps you know someone or know about someone you think should be on the show. Email me. And I'm on Twitter. The Catacombic Machine is too long for Twitter, so it's just Catacomb Machine. You'll find it. I am at Josef Gustafsson. And don't forget to check out the new homepage, thecatacombicmachine.com. There's some old stuff from Freestyle over there, but there's also some new articles, among them stuff from Peter Sjöstedt. So if you liked what he had to say today, maybe you want to read something from him as well. Check it out on the homepage. I'll talk to you guys again in 2 weeks. And in that episode, I will talk about Nietzsche and Deleuze and trickster myths and comedy with comedian Aron Flam. That will be awesome, so don't miss that in 2 weeks. Till then, adieu.